Mohammed and Colleen for putting this all together. I'll be talking about how to select craving or other, and I'll put the other in emphasis, patient-reported outcomes for an addiction neuromodulation trial. I am a VA employee, so I have to do the disclaimer, and I have no conflicts. So really what I hope that we get from today, and something that will continue in our conversations, is emphasizing that we really need a consensus in our field to define, as others have mentioned, clinically meaningful improvements in addiction recovery. So I'll be touching on briefly craving, kind of pros and cons of assessing craving as an in-the-moment response to treatment. Then I'll talk a little bit about relapse, as well as some new ideas, which we've all kind of been hearing throughout the day, and kind of helps validate my thoughts as I was putting this presentation together. So craving, or the intense desire for alcohol or another substance, is a commonly used, but again, an indirect treatment outcome. It's easy to measure, self-report questionnaires. There's a wide variety that you can use. It's inexpensive. But it's a really complex phenomenon that's been touched on earlier that is defined in lots of different ways and can mean different things for different people. So for example, we have someone here who is craving pizza because it makes her feel good and because she's in New York, and New York is the land of pizza. So more of a reward craving subset versus someone who maybe has a tummy ache and really, sorry, I have young kids, tummy ache, and really wants to have some like nice soft warm bread to soothe their tummy ache, so more of that relief craving. And then we have other types of craving, like obsessive craving, where you can't stop thinking about the substance and using it and seeking it, or compulsive craving, which has more of a behavioral component to it. So lots of different dimensions and lots of different ways to define craving, which make it an even more complicated outcome tool to use. We know that craving is kind of based with dopamine, opioids, glutamate, and serotonin in reward regions of the brain. So it makes you think, why not measure that a little bit more directly in the brain using things like neuroimaging-informed cue reactivity paradigms, which are very popular in our field as well. They are a more objective measure of brain state, especially as we move to a more reliable way of measuring these metrics. But it's very expensive, it's very time-consuming, and there's still a lot of skepticism around it. So instead of using craving as a primary clinical outcome, I would argue that use, as has been described earlier, could be a really nice transition. In my lab, we looked at clinical predictors of relapse, and this was to, as Colleen mentioned, the 6-month mark as the gold standard for alcohol use disorder. And craving was one of those, but when we put them all into a model, actually craving was not predictive. We have, sorry, the screen's very small, but things like anhedonic depression and smoking status, as well as a number of days since last use, were predictive of relapse. So we looked at kind of subscales of craving more specifically, really focused on the OCDS, which is an obsessive subscale of the OCDS measures obsessive craving. And we found the opposite pattern than what we expected. Those who went on to relapse actually had lower OCDS obsessive scores than those who went on to abstain. In further investigation, we saw that this was interacting with COMT genotype. And I think that's really common in the craving literature, that in and of itself, it is not necessary and maybe not the most reliable measure of relapse or predictor of relapse, but it does interact with lots of different factors to inform treatment outcomes, genotype, cognition, psychiatric symptoms. Lots of different things are interacting with craving to predict outcomes. So we also looked at neural predictors of relapse using a priori defined regions of interest, and we see that all of these regions contributed to an improved prediction of relapse. All of my emojis are gone, sorry. And so we kind of put these two up against each other and found that with clinical measures, we were able to predict about 73% of treatment outcomes. Again, this is binary relapse status, full abstinence versus any amount of alcohol consumption, and then look at the neural measures, and our classification accuracy definitely improves, suggesting that that might be a nice proxy to improve those definitions. So for trial outcomes, as has been mentioned, we really need to consider time frame. Again, our study looked at 6 months, but 3 months or 1 month are really common in the literature, and it's really rare to find something that goes out 12 months or beyond. We rely very heavily on self-report from our patients to describe how much they've used, tools like the timeline follow back. Really, the gold standard has been full abstinence for defining recovery, but Katie Wickowitz and others have really kind of pushed towards a more flexible model of recovery for alcohol, and I have learned today that that's the case for cocaine use as well. And so we can measure other things like percent heavy drinking days and seeing if we see reductions in those as well. These are memory-based assessments, so the reliability often comes into question, or at least reviewers often ask me that. We substantiate ours with medical record information, but another alternative solution would be to use something like ecological monetary assessment, so you're measuring these behaviors in real time on a very small time scale, which circumvents some of the the limitations of memory-based assessments. Another thing that reviewers often bring up is validating self-report with biological markers of use, which has been brought up. So using hair or blood or urine measures of metabolites to really understand whether individuals are using and how much. But we have to consider the half-life of the metabolites and also how it increases participant burden to have to come in for urine toxicology screens, and it really reduces the retention rates that you're going to get long term. So other clinical outcome measures are whether the diagnostic criteria are still met. I know there's a lot of controversy about using the diagnostic criteria versus other broader measures like the addiction neuroclinical assessment. But ultimately, if an individual hasn't met those criteria in over a year, with the exception of craving, because craving has very long persistent effects, would that person be deemed to be in recovery? We've also touched on earlier different measures, including quality of life, satisfaction of life, or as the FDA defines it, something that is meaningfully improving symptoms, function, or mortality. And then I'll kind of leave it with the biggest question that I have which is the percent responders, which were also touched on, instead of the average use patterns of the group in a treatment group. And can we start to come together and define clinically meaningful, not only non-responders, but also those who respond and those who go in full remission, to draw the parallel to the depression field. And so maybe someone who is fully abstinent is defined as that full remission, doing really well, but someone who has reduced the number of heavy drinking days or substantially improved their quality of life and has their drinking or substance use under more manageable terms and is not having problems with their use could be a responder, and having those different levels or metrics within our trials, I think, would be really a critical next step. So just to summarize, we obviously are here with wonderful people in the room who have described this, but we really need the FDA and the NIH requirements and recommendations, as well as the scientific community, to hopefully all align at some point, really focusing on the clinical significance of the trial outcomes that we're measuring, and ultimately adding more tools to our clinical toolbox to help these patients and disseminate the findings. So with that, this is my team, and thank you all for your attention.